The Old Testament is a super important part of the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Bible, which is also called the Tanakh. It has many books that were written a long time ago and talk about all sorts of different things. Let's take a closer look. First, let's talk about how the Old Testament is organized. If you're Protestant, it has 39 books and it's divided into three main parts. The first part is the Torah, the Law. In German Bibles from the time of the Reformation, this part is called the 5 books of Moses. The Torah, also called the Pentateuch, has the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis is the first book of Moses. It's about creation: Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Exodus is the second book of Moses. It's about the Israelites leaving Egypt, the 10 Commandments, and the agreement at Mount Sinai. Leviticus is the third book of Moses. It talks about the rules and laws for worship and life for the Israelites. Numbers is the fourth book of Moses. It's about the Israelites wandering in the desert and being counted. Deuteronomy is the 5th book of Moses. It repeats and explains laws, and it has Moses' farewell speeches. The second part is about the prophets, called Nevi'im. There are 2 groups of prophets. The earlier prophets are Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. These books tell the story of Israel, from when they conquered Canaan to when they were captured by Babylon. The later prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets like Hosea, Amos, and Micah. These books have the messages of the prophets, who told the Israelites to repent and be faithful to God. The third part is Ketuvim, the writings. The writings have many different kinds of writing: poetry and wisdom books. These are in Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Then there are history books like Ruth, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1 and 2 Chronicles. Finally, there's apocalyptic literature. The book of Daniel has visions and prophecies about the end of the world. People wrote the books of the Old Testament over a period of about 1,000 years, from about 1200 BC to 200 BC. They were written in Hebrew, and some parts were in Aramaic. People passed down the stories by carefully copying them and by telling them to each other. The creation story in Genesis tells us how God made the world and all the people. God's promise to Abraham and his family is a really important idea in the whole Old Testament. The Torah has many rules and laws that the Israelites followed. The 10 Commandments are the most famous rules, and they're the basis for right and wrong. The books of the prophets have the messages that the prophets gave to the Israelites, telling them to repent and be faithful to God. They warned people about what would happen if they didn't listen to God, but they also talked about hope and forgiveness. Wisdom books like Psalms and Proverbs teach us about spiritual and moral things. The Psalms are prayers and songs about all different parts of life and our relationship with God. The Old Testament tells the story of the Israelites, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the kings and prophets, to when they were captured by Babylon and when they returned to Jerusalem. This story is a big part of who Jewish people are and what they believe. The Old Testament has been incredibly important for Western culture, literature, and art. Lots of sayings, symbols, and stories from the Old Testament are part of our everyday lives. Both Jewish people and Christians believe the Old Testament is a holy book, but they understand and use it in different ways. For Jewish people, it's the basis for how they live and their traditions. Christians understand it through the New Testament and what Jesus taught. Bible scholars today use many different ways to understand the Old Testament, like looking at the history, the writing style, and the theology. These ways of looking at it help us understand the history and culture behind the stories, and also what they really mean. The Old Testament is a really interesting and complex book that's important for understanding both Jewish and Christian beliefs. It teaches us about history, theology, and ethics, and it's still something that inspires and teaches both believers and scholars.